August 27, 1973. Eduardo Danding Cojuangco sat across from Ferdinand Marcos in the presidential study at Malacañang Palace, listening to an offer that would make him one of the richest men in Asia. Marcos was explaining how the newly created coconut levy fund would work. Every coconut farmer in the Philippines would pay a tax on their production, and that money would be used to develop the coconut industry. What Marcos didn't explicitly say, but what both men understood, was that Eduardo Cojuangco would control that fund. And since the Philippines produced more coconuts than any other country in the world, that fund would eventually contain billions of dollars. Danding, Marcos said. Using Cojuangco's nickname, this is your chance to build an empire. But remember, you work for me. Cojuangco nodded respectfully. Of course, Mr. President, I understand completely. But Eduardo Cojuangco was lying. He understood much more than Ferdinand Marcos realized. Over the next 13 years he would use the Coconut Levy Fund to build the largest private business empire in Philippine history. And in the process he would steal more money than Ferdinand Marcos himself. This is the story of how the student surpassed the master, how the biggest crony became richer than the dictator who created him, and how the most successful partnership in Philippine corruption ended with the apprentice owning more stolen wealth than his teacher. To understand how Eduardo Cojuangco became richer than Ferdinand Marcos, you need to understand what Ferdinand Marcos had given him control over. The coconut levy wasn't just a taxes, it was a license to extract wealth from the most productive agricultural sector in the Philippines. In 1973, the Philippines produced 15.5 billion coconuts per year. The coconut industry employed 3.5 million farmers and generated $2 billion in export revenue. When Marcos created the Coconut Levy Fund, he was essentially giving Eduardo Cojuangco a tax on the entire industry. But the brilliance of the scheme wasn't the tax itself. It was what Cojuangco could do with the money once he controlled it. Instead of actually developing the coconut industry, he would use the fund to buy coconut processing facilities, coconut oil refineries, coconut export companies, and eventually coconut plantations themselves. Within a decade, Eduardo Cojuangco would own every aspect of the Philippine coconut industry from production to export. The farmers who paid the levy that funded his empire would end up selling their coconuts to companies he owned at prices he controlled. It was the most elegant theft in Philippine history, convinced 3.5 million farmers to pay for their own economic enslavement. But Eduardo Cojuangco wasn't content to just steal from coconut farmers. He used his relationship with Ferdinand Marcos to expand into every profitable industry in the Philippines. Banking, telecommunications, real estate, manufacturing, airlines, everywhere there was money to be made. Cojuangco found ways to use government connections to dominate markets and eliminate competition. The partnership between Marcos and Cojuangco was perfect, at least in the beginning. Marcos needed reliable allies who could manage complex business operations without creating political problems. Cojuangco needed government protection to build monopolies that would have been impossible in a competitive market. Most importantly, both men understood that their relationship was based on mutual benefit rather than friendship. Marcos provided political protection and regulatory advantages. Cojuangco provided financial support and business expertise. Neither man trusted the other, but both men profited enormously from their cooperation. The first major expansion of Cojuangco's empire came in 1976, when he used coconut levy funds to purchase the United Coconut Planters Bank. The acquisition was presented as a way to provide better banking services to coconut farmers, but the real purpose was to give Cojuangco control of a major financial institution that could fund his other business ventures. With UCPB under his control, Eduardo Cojuangco had access to both the Coconut Levy Fund and a major bank's lending capacity. He could now finance acquisitions that dwarfed anything other Philippine businessmen could attempt. More importantly, he could structure those acquisitions through shell companies and foreign subsidiaries that made it almost impossible to track his true wealth. Over the next 5 years, Cojuangco used this financial firepower to build the most diversified business empire in Southeast Asia. He bought coconut oil mills, copra trading companies, shipping lines, and coconut product manufacturers. He acquired real estate developments, shopping centers, and office buildings. He invested in mining companies, construction firms, and telecommunications ventures. But his most audacious move came in 1982, when he decided to challenge Ferdinand Marcos directly for control of the most profitable industry in the Philippines, beer. San Miguel Corporation was the largest food and beverage company in the Philippines, and its beer division generated more profit than any other consumer goods business in the country. For decades, San Miguel had been controlled by the Soriano family, one of the oldest and most respected business dynasties in the Philippines. But Eduardo Cojuangco saw an opportunity. The Soriano family's control of San Miguel depended on their shareholdings, and those shareholdings could be purchased if someone had enough money and political protection. Using coconut levy funds channeled through UCPB and various shell companies, Cojuangco began quietly buying San Miguel shares on the open market. Within 2 years he had accumulated enough stock to challenge the Soriano family's control of the company. The battle for San Miguel was conducted through corporate boardrooms rather than military conflicts, but it was just as ruthless as any armed confrontation. Cojuangco used his government connections to create regulatory problems for San Miguel's competitors. He used his banking relationships to restrict the Soriano family's access to credit. He used his political influence to ensure that government contracts favored San Miguel products. Most importantly, he used Ferdinand Marcos's authority to intimidate anyone who opposed his takeover. When independent shareholders questioned the source of his funding, government auditors suddenly became interested in their personal tax returns. When business journalists investigated his acquisition methods, they found their publishing licenses under regulatory review. By 1984, Eduardo Cojuangco controlled San Miguel Corporation, giving him dominance over not just the Philippine coconut industry, but also the country's most profitable consumer goods company. But the San Miguel acquisition revealed something that made Ferdinand Marcos profoundly uncomfortable. His biggest crony had become powerful enough to challenge established Philippine business families without needing direct presidential intervention. For the first time since martial law began, a Marcos ally had accumulated enough wealth and political influence to operate independently of Malacañang Palace. Eduardo Cojuangco was no longer just a crony, he was a rival power center within the Marcos system. The relationship between Marcos and Cojuangco began to change after the San Miguel takeover. Instead of the respectful subordination that had characterized their earlier interactions, there was now a subtle tension between two men who had accumulated vast wealth through the same corrupt system. Ferdinand Marcos began to worry that Eduardo Cojuangco was becoming too powerful, too independent, and potentially too dangerous. Cojuangco began to worry that Ferdinand Marcos might try to limit his expansion or redistribute his assets to other cronies. Both men started keeping secrets from each other. Marcos began diversifying his financial relationships, building ties with other cronies who could serve as counterweights to Cojuangco's growing influence. Cojuangco began moving assets offshore and establishing business relationships that didn't depend on Philippine government approval. The breaking point came in 1985. When Eduardo Cojuangco made a decision that shocked Ferdinand Marcos, he announced his intention to run for vice president of the Philippines. For 12 years Cojuangco had been content to exercise power from behind the scenes, using his business empire to influence government policy without holding government office. But by 1985 he had accumulated so much wealth and political influence that he believed he could transition from crony to politician. Ferdinand Marcos saw this as the ultimate betrayal. He had created Eduardo Cojuangco, given him the coconut levy fund, protected his business acquisitions, and enabled his rise to become one of the richest men in Asia. The idea that Cojuangco would use that power to seek independent political office was not just ingratitude, it was a direct challenge to Marcos's authority. The confrontation between them was conducted privately, but its intensity was evident to everyone in their circle. Marcos demanded that Cojuangco withdraw from the vice presidential race and return to his role as a businessman. Cojuangco refused, arguing that his business success had given him the credibility and resources to serve in government. What neither man realized was that their dispute was taking place just as the entire Marcos system was beginning to collapse. The Aquino assassination, economic crisis, and growing opposition had made both Marcos's political position and Cojuangco's business empire increasingly vulnerable to attack. When people power brought down the Marcos regime in February 1986, Eduardo Cojuangco found himself in an impossible position. He had built his empire through government connections that no longer existed. He had accumulated wealth through systems that the new government was determined to dismantle. Most dangerously, he had become the symbol of everything that was wrong with crony capitalism. The new Cory Aquino administration immediately moved to seize control of the Coconut Levy Fund and the companies that Cojuangco had purchased with those funds. Within months he had lost operational control of San Miguel Corporation, United Coconut Planters Bank, and most of his coconut industry holdings. But Eduardo Cojuangco had learned something from Ferdinand Marcos that served him well during this crisis. the importance of hiding assets in places where Philippine governments couldn't easily reach them. While Ferdinand Marcos had focused on accumulating power within the Philippines, Cojuangco had been more strategic about international diversification. He had established businesses in Hong Kong, Singapore, and the United States that were legally separate from his Philippine operations. He had moved significant assets offshore through shell companies and trust arrangements that were difficult to trace and harder to seize. Most importantly, he had maintained business relationships with international partners who valued his expertise and connections regardless of political changes in the Philippines. As a result, while Ferdinand Marcos died in exile as a relatively poor man dependent on the charity of the Hawaiian government, Eduardo Cojuangco was able to rebuild his fortune using assets that had been protected from Philippine government seizure. By the 1990s, Eduardo Cojuangco had not only recovered from the collapse of the Marcos regime, he had become richer than he had ever been during the martial law period. His international investments had grown dramatically, his offshore assets had appreciated in value, and his business expertise had made him a sought-after partner for multinational corporations entering Asian markets. When he finally returned to the Philippines in the late 1990s, Eduardo Cojuangco did something that Ferdinand Marcos had never been able to do. He regained control of the business empire he had built during his Crony years. Through patient legal maneuvering and strategic partnerships, Cojuangco gradually regained influence over San Miguel Corporation and other companies that had been seized by the government. He couldn't openly reclaim ownership, but he could position himself as an indispensable business partner for the international companies that had acquired control of his former assets. By the 2000s, Eduardo Cojuangco was once again one of the most powerful businessmen in the Philippines. But unlike during the Marcos years, his power was based on legitimate business success rather than government connections. Today, estimates of Eduardo Cojuangco's wealth vary widely, but most financial analysts believe he accumulated between $5 billion and $8 billion during his Crony years, significantly more than the $3 billion to $5 billion that Ferdinand Marcos is believed to have stolen. The comparison reveals something crucial about their different approaches to corruption. Ferdinand Marcos was a politician who stole money to fund his political ambitions. Eduardo Cojuangco was a businessman who used political connections to build legitimate business empires. When the political protection disappeared, Marcos's stolen wealth became a liability that made him a target for asset recovery efforts. But Cojuangco's business empires retained their underlying economic value regardless of how they had been acquired. The student had indeed surpassed the master, but he had done so by learning from Ferdinand Marcos's mistakes rather than repeating them. Ferdinand Marcos had taught Eduardo Cojuangco how to steal from the Philippine people, but Cojuangco had taught himself how to transform stolen money into legitimate wealth that could survive political changes. In the end, Eduardo Cojuangco proved that he was a better criminal than Ferdinand Marcos, not because he stole more money, but because he was better at keeping it. The partnership between Ferdinand Marcos and Eduardo Cojuangco represents the purest example of how crony capitalism worked during the martial law period. The dictator provided political protection and regulatory advantages. The crony provided business expertise and financial resources. Both men profited enormously from the arrangement. But the relationship also demonstrates the inherent instability of corrupt partnerships. When both parties are criminals, trust becomes impossible, and competition becomes inevitable. Ferdinand Marcos created Eduardo Cojuangco to serve his political needs, but he created him too well, giving him too much power and too many resources. When Cojuangco became powerful enough to operate independently, he became a threat to the very system that had created him. August 27, 1973, one meeting, one offer. The beginning of the most successful criminal partnership in Philippine history. Ferdinand Marcos thought he was creating a loyal subordinate who would help him steal from the Philippine people. Instead, he created a rival who would ultimately steal more than the master who taught him. The dictator who trusted his biggest crony discovered too late that in a system built on theft, everyone is ultimately stealing from everyone else. And the biggest thief of all turned out to be the one who learned best from the master's mistakes. Eduardo Cojuangco didn't just steal Ferdinand Marcos's money, he stole Ferdinand Marcos's methods, improved upon them, and used them to become richer than the man who had taught him everything he knew about corruption. The student had become the master, and the master had created his own replacement.